other hand, were too much absorbed by their prospective freedom to aid us in taking any further steps to secure it. Captain Trowbridge, who had by this time landed at a different point, got quite into despair over the seeming deafness of the people to all questions. How many soldiers were there on the bluff? He asked of the first comer. Massa, the man said, stuttering terribly, I c. Tell me, how many soldiers are there? Roared Trowbridge in his mighty voice, and all but shaking the poor old thing in his thirst for information. Oh, massa, recommenced in terror the incapacitated witness, I carpenter, holding up eagerly a little stump of a hatchet, his sole treasure, as if his profession ought to excuse from all military opinions. I wish that it were possible to present all this scene from the point of view of the slaves themselves. It can be most nearly done, perhaps, by quoting the description given by a similar scene on the Combahee River by a very aged man who had been brought down on the previous raid already mentioned. I wrote it down in a tent long after, while the old man recited his tale with much gesticulation at the door, and it is by far the best glimpse I have ever had through a negro's eyes at these wonderful birthdays of freedom. "De people was all hoeing, massa," said the old man. "Dey was a hoeing in the rice fields when de gunboats come. Den ebry man drop dem hoe, and de lef de rice. De massa he stand and call, 'Run to de woods for hide, Yankee come, sell you to Cuba, run for hide.' Ebry man he run, and, my God, run all tudder way. Massa stand in de wood, peep, peep, fade for truss," afraid to truss. He say, "Run to de wood," and ebry man run by him, straight to de boat. De brack soldier so presumptuous, dey come right ashore, hold up de head. Fust ting I know, dere a barn, 10,000 bushel rough rice, all in a blaze, dem massa's great house all cracklin' up de roof. Didn't I keer for see 'em blaze? Law, massa didn't care nothing at all, was gwine to de boat." Dawes' Don Quixote could not surpass the sublime absorption to which the old gaunt man, with arm uplifted, described this stage of affairs, till he ended in a shrewd chuckle worthy of Sancho Panza. Then he resumed, "De brack soldiers so presumptuous." This he repeated 3 times, slowly shaking his head in an ecstasy of admiration. It flashed upon me that the apparition of a black soldier must amaze those still in bondage, much as a butterfly just from the chrysalis might astound his fellow grubs. I inwardly vowed that my soldiers at least should be as presumptuous as I could make them. Then he went on. "Ole woman and I go down to de boat. Den dey say behind us, 'Rebels comin', rebels comin'.' Ole woman say, 'Come ahead, come plenty ahead.' I hab notin' on but my shirt and pantaloon. Ole woman one single frock he hab on, and one handkerchief on he head. I lef all 2 of my blanket and run for de rebel come, and den dey didn't come, didn't trust for come. I's 88 year old, massa. My ole Massa Lowndes kept all de ages in a big book, and when we come to age ob sense we mark 'em down ebry year, so I know. Too ole for come, massa joking. Neber too ole for to leave de land of bondage. I old, but great food for chil'en, gib 1,000 tank ebry day. Young people can go through, massa, but de old folk must go slow." Such emotions as these no doubt were inspired by our arrival, but we could only hear their hasty utterance in passing, our duty being, with the small force already landed, to take possession of the bluff. Ascending with proper precautions the wooded hill, we soon found ourselves in the deserted camp of a light battery, amid scattered remaining equipments and suggestions of a very unattractive breakfast. As soon as possible, skirmishers were thrown out through the woods to the farther edge of the bluff, while a party searched the houses, finding the usual large supply of furniture and pictures brought up for safety from below, but no soldiers. Captain Trowbridge had then got the John Adams beside the row of piles, and went to work for their removal. Again I had the exciting sensation of being within the hostile lines, the eager explorations, the doubts, the watchfulness, the listening for every sound of coming hoofs. Presently a horse's tread was heard in earnest, but it was a squad of our own men bringing in 2 captured cavalry soldiers. One of these, a sturdy fellow, submitted quietly to his lot, only begging that, whenever he should be evacuated from the bluff, a note should be left behind stating that he was a prisoner. The other, a very young man, and a member of the rebel troop, a sort of cadet corps among the Charleston youths, came to me in great wrath, complaining that the corporal of our squad had kicked him after he had surrendered. His air of offended pride was very rueful, and it did indeed seem a pathetic reversal of fortunes for the two races. To be sure, the youth was a scion from one of the foremost families of South Carolina, and when I considered the wrongs which the black race had encountered from those of his blood, first and last, it seemed as if the most scrupulous recording angel might tolerate one final kick to square the account. But I reproved the corporal, who respectfully disclaimed the charge, and said the kick was an incident of the scuffle. It certainly was not their habit to show such poor malice. They thought too well of themselves. His demeanor seemed less lofty, but perhaps piteous, when he implored me not to put him on board any vessel which was to ascend the upper stream, and hinted, by awful implications, the danger of such ascent. This meant torpedoes, a peril which we treated in those days with rather mistaken contempt. But we found none on the Edisto, and it may be that it was only a foolish attempt to alarm us. Meanwhile, Trowbridge was toiling away at the row of piles, which proved easier to draw out than to saw asunder, either work being hard enough. It took far longer than we had hoped, and we saw noon approach and the tide fall rapidly, taking with it, inch by inch, our hopes of effecting a surprise at the bridge. During this time, and indeed all day, the detachments on shore under Captains Whitney and Sampson were having occasional skirmishes with the enemy, while the colored people were swarming to the shore or running to and fro like ants with the poor treasures of their houses. Our busy quartermaster, Mr. Bingham, who died afterwards from the overwork of that sultry day, was transporting the refugees on board the steamer, or hunting up bales of cotton, or directing the burning of rice-houses, in accordance with our orders. No dwelling-houses were destroyed or plundered by our men, Sherman's bummers not having yet arrived, although I asked no questions as to what the plantation negroes might bring in their great bundles. One piece of property, I must admit, seemed a lawful capture, a United States dress-sword of the old pattern, which had belonged to the rebel general who afterwards gave the order to bury Colonel Shaw with his niggers. That I have retained, not without some satisfaction, to this day. A passage having been cleared at last, and the tide having turned by noon, we lost no time in attempting the ascent, leaving the bluff to be held by the John Adams, and by a small force on shore. We were scarcely above the obstructions, however, when the little tug went aground, and the Enoch Dean, ascending a mile farther, had an encounter with a battery on the right, perhaps our old enemy, and drove it back. Soon after, she also ran aground, a misfortune of which our opponent strangely took no advantage, and, on getting off, I thought it best to drop down to the bluff again, as the tide was still hopelessly low. None can tell, save those who have tried them, the vexations of those muddy southern streams, navigable only during a few hours of flood tide. After waiting an hour, the two small vessels again tried the ascent. The enemy on the right had disappeared, but we could now see, far off on our left, another light battery moving parallel with the river, apparently to meet us at some upper bend. But for the present we were safe, and the low rice-fields on each side of us, and the scene was so peaceful, it seemed as if all danger were done. For the first time we saw in South Carolina blossoming river-banks and low emerald meadows that seemed like New England. Everywhere there were the same rectangular fields, smooth canals, and bushy dikes. A few negroes stole out to us in dugouts, and breathlessly told us how others had been hurried away by the overseers. We glided safely on, mile after mile. The day was unutterably hot, and all else seemed propitious. The men had their combustibles all ready to fire the bridge, and our hopes were unbounded. But by degrees the channel grew more tortuous and difficult, and while the little Milton glided smoothly over everything, the Enoch Dean, my own boat, repeatedly grounded. On every occasion of especial need, too, something went wrong in her machinery. Her engine had been constructed on some wholly new patent, of which, I should hope, this trial would prove entirely sufficient. The black pilot, who was not a soldier, grew more and more bewildered, and declared that it was the channel and not his brain which had gone wrong. The captain, a little elderly man, sat wringing his hands in the pilot-box, and the engineer appeared to be mingling his groans with those of the diseased engine.